Well, hello and welcome to this session. What I'm going to talk about today is the difference between a hazard and a risk. And it's something that I think a lot of organisations actually get confused. The reality is, a hazard and a risk are completely different. The hazard is actually a source of risk. It's not the risk event itself. So, how do you actually determine the difference between a hazard and a risk? Well, if we look at the definition of a risk from a safety perspective, we look at a risk is equal to the hazard times the exposure. So we're looking at the risk in terms of a couple of things. First and foremost, what is the actual hazard? So is it a tool, or is it a process, or is it a piece of equipment? We then look at the exposure that people have to that particular hazard and what controls are in place to determine whether there could be an impact in terms of a risk. So I'll give you a classic example. Working at heights, that is a hazard, but that's not the risk. There are a couple of risks that come from that hazard of working from heights or working at heights. First and foremost, worker falls from heights. And then you can actually determine, well, what controls do we have in place? What's the likelihood of that going to occur? Are they actually wearing the harnesses, and so on and so forth? We could have a second risk from that, which is that a worker drops equipment or tools from height. Obviously, there are different controls around that, and you would then look at the likelihood of that event occurring and, of course, the consequences and so forth. So the reality here is that the hazard is actually just a source of risk. It's something that's there. It's the interaction between the human and that source of risk that actually can give rise to an event occurring. So an iceberg sitting in the middle of the ocean is a hazard. But if you travel too close to that iceberg, then you have a risk of collision. So one of the things that you need to avoid in your workplace is simply saying, well, I've got a hazard over there, I need to eliminate that hazard. Determine the actual exposure to that and determine the levels of controls that you've got in place to determine what the likelihood of the event is. Because there's no likelihood of a hazard. It's either there or it's not there. This is a really important point to note, because in some organisations I'm dealing with, there's this desire to actually get rid of all of the hazards, when in reality there's no need to do that. The most ridiculous one I've seen is an organisation in the Northern Territory where a safety person had determined that that the mangoes falling out of a tree was a hazard, and that the risk was that somebody was going to be struck by a mango. As I pointed out to that person, the reason that the mangoes fall out of trees is because they're ripe. So the greatest consequence that you're going to have from that is potentially mango-smelling hair. His idea was to chop all of the mango trees down in this particular organisation, which is absolutely ludicrous and taking it to a level that's far beyond what it needs to. So let's get some common sense in this. Identify the hazard, look at the exposure, look at the controls and their effectiveness, and then ask yourself the question, what's the event that could come from this? And then you will determine a risk level. And from that risk level, we do exactly the same as what we do with all other risks. We determine what are the consequences if it occurs. Now, what we do need to remember, as I've spoken about before, there is no such thing as a one consequence event. So what you need to do is to ask yourself the question, all right, well, if that does happen, what would the safety impacts be? But what would be the reputation impacts? What would be the compliance impacts? Would there be a financial impact? And assess that risk against all of the critical success factors that you've got in your consequence matrix. So that's all I've got for this particular session. As always, let's be careful out there.